Good morning. Steve here in Southern Illinois. It's a beautiful spring morning. Our church is having a statewide church service today, something we never would have dreamed of attempting 3 months ago. But at 11 o'clock, I'm going to be there. So I decided to pre-record this because I have some thoughts to share with you. It's been 10 weeks since COVID disrupted our lives here in Southern Illinois. 10 long weeks. I know for some of you elsewhere it's been even longer. I can't remember when our society, our communities, all over the world have been under such prolonged stress. We have natural disasters here in Southern Illinois, tornadoes, floods. They come, they do their thing, they go. Okay. They're physical, they're defined, they're concrete. We have news sources that we rely on to warn us when bad storms are coming or when the waters are rising. We can step outside and look at the clouds and know that a storm is dangerous. We can watch the rivers rise as the rains fall. Okay? COVID's not that way at all. It's invisible. We're relying on experts we've never heard of, who are using language that we're not familiar with. It's so easy to be uncertain. And when COVID is gone, what's going to be left behind? When a flood happens, we deal with mud, we deal with water damage, but we know how to mop floors. We know how to tear out water-damaged walls and repair them. When a tornado comes, it tears up trees, it blows the roofs off houses, but we can handle a chainsaw. We know how to use a hammer. There's something physical for us to do. When COVID's gone, what will we need to do to recover? Our lives will be disrupted. Many of us will never be the same. The economy's been disrupted globally. How do you fix an economy? How do you put it back together? How do you get it started? Nobody knows. Nobody's ever done this before. Stress. Reminds me of a story in Jesus' life. Matthew spends 4 chapters talking about it. Chapter 10 through 14. Mark and Luke each devote a chapter. Mark chapter 6, Luke chapter 9. Read them later. Let me just give you a synopsis, though. The disciples had finished, well, let's call it How to Be a Disciple 101, the initial stage of their training. And as the final exercise, Jesus had sent them out on a missionary journey. They were supposed to go find an audience to talk to. No more preaching to the choir, so to speak. And this was a group assignment. My students in college loved group assignments. You never heard so much moaning and groaning. He's taking charge of everything. He won't let me help. He won't let me do anything. Or, she won't do anything. She's not keeping up her end of the part. I have to do everything. I imagine the disciples weren't any different. Group assignments require a lot of negotiation, and teams are hard to bring together. Plus, they were stepping out of the laboratory and facing real audiences with unpredictable reactions. I imagine some of them came back with some pretty uncomfortable stories. Others came back on top of the world. The team had worked together great. They were ready to conquer the world. They were so confident, they had no idea what they were facing. And Jesus said to them, "Come apart and rest a while." But that wasn't the only stressor that was going on. You see, while the disciples had been gone, John the Baptist had been murdered. No trial. He hadn't got to bear testimony. He hadn't gotten to tell his side of the story. He hadn't had his day in court. Instead, his head was chopped off in a dark dungeon because an old woman's pride had been injured, and a king had gotten drunk and made some boasts in a party in front of his friends that he didn't want to back down on. What kind of a death is that? What kind of meaning can you draw from that? His disciples came and, picked up his body parts and carried them away and buried them. And then they showed up on Jesus' doorstep to tell him what had happened. Stress. And Jesus' response was, "Come aside and rest a while." This week I attended a meeting of the Fairfield Area Ministerial Alliance. This is when the pastors in the area get together and share stories and support each other. First time this has happened since COVID started, and we were doing it through Zoom, which was a new experience for some of us. We were sharing the stress that our people were experiencing, how we'd tried to cope as pastors, what the churches were doing. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of this, one of the pastors spoke out and said, "Well, COVID has just completely revitalized me. It's changed our church. I can't believe how engaged people are. And I can't believe how much I have neglected the Sabbath for decades. It's such a beautiful thing." And there was silence. Nobody else spoke up, because we Christians have a strained relationship with the Sabbath. Now, I'm not going to go into that today, okay? Maybe we'll talk about that another day. But I wanted to share a story with you from Africa that encapsulates for me the good news about the Sabbath. It was my last week there, and against my wife's better judgment, I had tried to squeeze in another trip to the clinic that was furthest away from the hospital. Part of my job there was going out to these remote clinics, and the team would bring vaccinations with us because we had refrigeration, and which was rare in those areas. And I would see patients who were sick, or just do well visits for pregnant women and babies. And I loved this trip because we drove through mountains and we passed a volcano. We went across a bridge that was so rickety we had to walk across it first to make sure the boards were still in place, and make sure no new holes had developed that were so big that the truck's tires would fall through. I loved it. I like adventure. And while we were there at the clinic, this was an overnight trip, and all of us just slept on the porch out in the cool, pulling up blankets, well, not blankets, just sheets up over our heads to keep the mosquitoes away. At least they were supposed to keep the mosquitoes away. But this trip, about halfway through the day, seeing patients, I started chilling and getting feverish and aching all over. Now, here in America, we'd probably think of that as the flu coming on, but in most of the world, that means you're having a malarial attack. And sure enough, after about an hour, the head of the clinic came to me and said, "Steve, I'll take over. You go lay down. You are not looking good." So I went and slept for a few hours, woke up still feverish, still aching. Medicine hadn't taken effect yet. At Elkanah, the clinic had brought me some food, and after I'd finished eating, he said, "I'm taking you home." I said, "No, we haven't finished the work. We've still got 2 more clinics to visit. Okay, let's keep going. I'll make it through this malarial attack." He said, "No way. I am not bringing you back sick as a dog to Mrs. Scott when she didn't want you to come on this trip anyhow." So I gave in, and we got into the truck and started driving back. As we passed the last village, went through the last village before the mountains, There was an elderly gentleman by the roadside with some family, and they flagged us down. Not an uncommon experience. Rides are hard to come by in some parts in Africa. So we gave the elderly gentleman a ride. He needed to go to a village further on our path. And like he usually did, Elkanah struck up a conversation, talking about family, how life was going in the village. And then he asked one of his regular questions. So, what religion are you? Are you a Muslim, a Christian? It's not a threatening question in Africa. Everybody's religious. And people were glad to share what they believed. This gentleman happened to be a Christian, but it really didn't matter what he answered, because that was just a segue question, a transitional question to what Elkanah really wanted to talk about. Good news about the Sabbath. So when the man told what his religion was, Elkanah said, "Have you heard the good news about the Sabbath?" And the old man turned to him and said, "No, tell me about the Sabbath." And Elkanah said, "Well, in the beginning, when God was making the earth, before there was any sin, there was any death, or there was any suffering, it only took him 6 days to finish his work. And on the seventh day, he said, 'Let's rest.' And he spent that day with his creation. And he made that day holy." Years later, when Moses was leading the Hebrews out of Egypt, in Exodus 20, it tells us that God told them, "Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy." Rest. That was good news to people who had spent lifetimes in slavery. When Jesus was here, he kept the Sabbath. Luke tells us that his custom was every Sabbath he would go to the synagogue and teach and worship. Paul did the same thing. Acts chapter 17 tells us that was his habit. And Isaiah tells us that in the new earth, when God recreates everything and sin is gone, there's no more death or tears or suffering, Sabbath will be a part of our lives even then. So Sabbath has been with us from the beginning. It's a gift that God gave us, a gift of rest, a gift of hope, a gift of redemption, and it will be with us in the end. Now, this usually started a conversation as people shared their experience with Sabbath or not, but this old man burst into tears. And Elkanah and I looked at each other in confusion. Eventually, the man got control of his emotions and he said, "You don't understand. I've been asking about the Sabbath for over 40 years and nobody has been willing to share it with me. I can't read or write. But one day in church, they read the 10 Commandments and I heard that God told us to remember the Sabbath and that the Sabbath was the 7th day. And I asked them to explain why we worshiped on this first day and what that meant and why we did that. And nobody has been willing to talk to me about it. You've told me more in 5 minutes than I've learned about the Sabbath in my entire life. I can't tell you how thankful I am." Elkanah had a long conversation with him, not about the day that he kept, but about what Sabbath means. For me personally, Sabbath is an antidote to the busyness of life. I'm probably like most of you. I measure my worth and the meaning of my life by my productivity. If I don't do anything or if I feel unproductive, I feel worthless. But Sabbath, God says, don't work. Don't be productive. Your value does not derive from your work. Your value is in your relationship with me. There are lots of other things that Sabbath brings into my life. It gives me time with my family. gives me time with friends. My relationship with my children would not be what it is today if I hadn't had time every week to spend with them. So my question for you today is, have you heard the good news about the Sabbath? When Jesus' disciples were under stress, he told them, "Come aside and rest a while." And that's what the Sabbath is. An invitation every week to come aside and rest, to step out of the stress of your life, to step out of the busyness, and to focus on your relationship with God and the prime directives. Love the Lord with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. Be safe, be prudent, but above all, look up. Have a good day.